Liberty and equality.
But fear within a city.
A free white Englishwoman.
Of course, Lord Cornwallis himself.
Friends, you have been a delight. It is always a pleasure.
The dignity and worth of human personality.
It seems that every few months we hear something has happened in Boston. I'm assuming you're speaking of the incident with the tea?
Seems as though a ship came into Boston Harbor and docked and it had on it some tea.
We have made it very clear for almost 7 years that we would have no tea shipped here, but it was sent anyway, and perhaps that's why it came to an unfortunate end.
Reckon the folks up there felt like the tea was overtaxed. So, seemed like a bunch of white men dressed up like naturals.
Criminals boarded one of the ships in Boston Harbor, perhaps even several, and destroyed private property.
Oh, the tea went in the harbor, and I think it sent the right message that we were trying to send.
There were a number of Indians who took it upon themselves to be longshoremen.
If you're fighting for a cause that you really believe in, why would you disguise yourself as someone else?
And they unloaded a number of chests of tea, more than 300 chests of tea. Being unskilled, however, at the trade, they regretfully fell short of the wharves.
Drivel, honestly. Other reports have said that it has been a protest of some kind.
I know they are members of that group, the so-called Sons of Liberty.
Patriots.
Thugs.
Hypocrites.
The Sons of Liberty, by reputation, warlike, move against these oppressive taxes put forward by Great Britain, rather than moving through the accommodations of the law. Instead, endeavor to light that fuse of revolution and war.
Truly, these Sons of Liberty, they have their own ends. They think that they are this righteous arm, and really all they do is go about causing problems. For the past almost 10 years or so, threatening people's lives, destroying property, as no doubt they've done in Boston. I have no qualms at all saying that they're the ones who did it. And they did it with full fervence of knowing it because they disagree upon taxation.
I heard it was something about taxes.
They don't want to pay the tax on tea.
It was one of the stated goods of the Townshend Act back in 1767, placing unlawful duties upon certain goods which by law we may only acquire by way of our mother country. Most of those various items were lifted from the Townshend Act, and yet the tax on tea remained.
Unrightful tax on things that we don't need in the first place.
I'll give you a very, very simple answer to all of this. If you don't want to pay a tax on tea, don't buy tea.
These events in Massachusetts, coupled with protests taking place throughout the continent of North America, will lead to great advantage.
Any threat whatsoever to the public liberty is deserving of protest.
Protest? Even if it's a destruction of someone else's property, if it gets the point across, it gets the point across. They're just things.
Absolutely not. The law is there to protect everyone. So if you're going to break the law, you're proving that you want to stand on the inverse side of it, and that it's going to be used against you. Now, there are avenues within our British rights to exercise and express your displeasure in very civil manners. And as soon as the application of violence comes to pass, that is when you take your rights and you throw them out the window.
But it all depends on who protested. It could be a good protest, but if it doesn't suit their needs, well, me personally, I protest. The law say they can kill me.
As an enslaved person, a lot of people believe that insurrections are forms of resistance, and they are. Those are the big ones. But then there are other forms of resistance.
You simply do not buy the thing that bears the extra duty or tax, and it will soon be repealed. And it's worked.
We've tried it before. Non-importation, I mean. It doesn't work.
Simply put, no taxation without representation.
If it makes sense that you want to be represented because you've given out your money, why don't it make sense that I get paid for the work that I do?
No representation is curious to me. For them to come home to us who have absolutely no representation and cannot protest It's a curiosity.
Who can speak to the intentions of a group of small people? These sons of liberty, by their reputation, have denigrated themselves into a mob. But having faced over 10 years of oppressive taxation and legislation from the British government, my assumption is that these sons of liberty, regardless for their reasonings, took action to accelerate the wheel of revolution, to make greater statement that we will not suffer under these taxes, under this legislation, and that Great Britain's self-interest will not overleap the people of America's liberties.
I expect that those in Boston will find themselves suffering somewhat as a result of these actions. Whenever anything else has happened, the king has had to respond. If a child does something that it oughtn't to do, they must be punished, or how does the child learn? And also must be made an example of.
What will be the outcome of these protests? Further discordance betwixt ourselves and Great Britain? Further policies that curtail these liberties in the name of safety? Abroad, these protests should do nothing but accelerate the wheel of revolution, but domestically, I do believe they will turn to great advantage. They will cast a mirror upon the true condition of affairs upon this continent, and from there, move more to the side of revolution and liberty.
For me, nothing will change. I will still wake up every day enslaved, whether they have their tea or not.
Good afternoon, Mr. Henry. And good afternoon to everybody who's joining us. As always, we encourage you to submit any questions that you may have for Mr. Henry here in Williamsburg, and we will be joined shortly by John Randolph from London. But to begin, Mr. Henry, a lot has changed since we spoke last about the incident with the tea there in Boston. Several years. Here we find ourselves in 1777. Can you tell us what has transpired in that time?
Much has taken place since that event in December of 1773. The British government, in its infinite wisdom, determined that they would punish each and every man, woman, and child in the entire colony of Massachusetts by imposing a number of laws known as the Intolerable Acts, revoking the Royal Charter of Massachusetts, imposing military government, quartering British troops within the homes of the citizenry, and perhaps most obnoxious, the Boston Port Bill, which decreed that upon the 1st of June in 1774, the British Navy would blockade the port of Boston, allowing no traffic in nor out, which obviously was going to create a great deal of suffering and misery for many thousands of innocents in Massachusetts who had nothing at all to do with destroying all that tea. Here in Williamsburg, upon learning of the impending catastrophe in the north, our House of Burgesses determined that we would observe a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer to show our support and sympathy for our distressed brethren in Boston. Royal Governor Lord Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses with that, and in truth, we never met again as a colonial legislature of any substance. However, we did meet in several extra-legal assemblies, known as conventions here in Virginia, as well as a Grand Congress, which still meets to this day in Philadelphia City. We have exhausted all means of having a peaceful reconciliation with our mother country. But unhappily, in April of 1775, there was a most diabolical conspiracy designed by the British government to remove all of our stores of gunpowder for our own self-defense. In safeguarding that powder in Massachusetts, blood was spilled at Lexington Green in April of 1775. And that civil war with our mother country, which we had long sought to prevent, began in earnest. Though it wore for 13 months, finally it was here in Williamsburg, in Virginia, that the 5th Virginia Convention unanimously declared that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. We were joined in this bid for independence by the whole of the Congress in July of 1776, and that is not quite a year ago, but the war still rages, And you may certainly imagine the distress and the hardships upon our people.
Good afternoon to you, Mr. Randolph. Thank you so much for joining us today from London. Perhaps you might begin by telling us how long you have been here in London and what spurred you to come here.
Well, truly, I only arrived here in London in approximately November of the year 1775, so I've only been here with my wife and daughters for about a year and a half. Truly, I was first welcomed into Lord Dunmore's home, his lands holdings up around Stirling in Scotland, and then we came here to London, securing a home where I currently am in Brompton. Now, at present, though I am not within Virginia, I am still the King's Attorney for the colony of Virginia. Living here in London amongst a sea of other American refugees, all fleeing the terrible civil war that's gripping our homeland just now. In many ways, I am here as a bit of a protest of my own, if you want to call it that. Wanting nothing to do and wanting to prove to all of the gentlemen back in Virginia that what they're doing is wrong. Yet they would not hear reason at the time, so the only way that I could prove to them was to remove myself completely, or remove my family completely from that place where we might be safe and secure, and what is more secure within the British Empire than London itself.
Thank you.
Governor Henry, I suppose I should say, when we last spoke, we spoke upon the subject of protests. With what has happened thus far, do you feel that these protests that we have taken part in here on this side of the Atlantic have been successful? Were they a hindrance? Did they lead us to this road for independency?
We endeavored in several different manners to bring about redress to our grievances. Of course, we followed legal matters in submitting humble petitions to the Crown, an olive branch, upon one occasion which was rejected out of hand, His Majesty himself refusing to read anything writ by rebels. We tried to affect them financially by having an embargo of trade here in the American colonies, that we would cease all imports as well as exports, with the idea being that once British manufacturers felt that pinch in their pockets from the loss of American monies, that they would bring pressure to bear upon members of Parliament to repeal these intolerable acts. Alas, that did not have enough time to be successful, because then blood was spilled at Lexington. And the idea of returning as dutiful subjects to the Crown after that was absurd.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Randolph, you have called this your protest. What are your thoughts on the protests that served as precursors to the current conflict?
Well, truly, I will say this. My opinion upon protest has not changed these many years. Protest is a British right. It is something that we are allowed to exercise as Britons, so long as it does not become violent, so long as things are not destroyed. That was my position before, it is my position now, truly. So in many ways, these protests, even if you want to call them that, the destruction of the tea, the meeting of arms at Lexington Green, that was an act of violence. Both of them were, truly. And as such, they are outside of the law, and thus makes them illegal, makes them a riot. So as far as protesting, I feel that I've done something very, very peacefully, removing myself from the situation very publicly, very clearly, letting everyone see it happen, using my own face. The men of Boston could truly take a bit of a lesson there, to use your own face instead of hiding behind someone else's.
Mr. Henry, we have a question about the pairing of protest and violence. Clearly there are peaceful forms of protest. As you stated, the colonies endeavored to exercise those peaceful forms of protest, and yet ultimately be pushed past that. Do you think that there is a clear line of when protest gets pushed into non-peaceful forms?
Again, after we have exhausted all peaceable, reasonable, and constitutional means to seeking redress to our grievances, and if the British government, in its tyrannical ways, was pressing forward to deprive us of our precious rights and liberties, unhappily it did have to resort to violence. We again exhaust peaceful manners first, but if it turns to violence to achieve our success, then by gosh, it must happen.
Mr. Randolph, you had the privilege to pack up your family and move to London as your protest. But if one does not have the money or the luxury time to effect such a change in their own life, how would you suggest that they go about protesting what they consider to be infringement upon their liberty?
Well, I have no doubt, truly, that these poor souls who could not do as I have done, could not remove themselves to places where the king's forces hold sway, these people are the ones who are in the most danger. These are the ones who I'm hearing stories from throughout America, people being removed from their homes, being thrown out in the street, having their property confiscated directly, simply because they disagree with what the Congress that meets in Philadelphia does. Because they disagree with what the governments that have been set up provisionally outside of the king's authority all say, which is something that is dreadful and terrible, and it's something that people are not speaking on. These people truly have my dearest sympathies, and I wish I could do more to help them. I've been endeavoring somewhat in London to raise a fund for these people, to help them to do as I have done, but it is never quite enough. As far as what they can do, I can only encourage them to continue to do as they have done. Stand firm as the rest of the world is raging around them, as this flood of American liberty and American sympathy is coming forward. Be the firm oak tree that is standing against the earth and tell them, no, you must move.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Henry, we have a question now about protests, specifically forms of monuments and statues. Is their destruction appropriate, or is there a different means by which you felt that perhaps monuments to former monarchs might be dealt with?
Here in Williamsburg, shortly following our Declaration of Independence in May of 1776, that very day, a large portrait of His Majesty King George III was removed from the walls of the House of Burgesses, torn into several pieces, and each piece then severally burned in the Capitol yard. At the same time, there had been a statue of Lord Botetourt, a much beloved and most highly affectionated royal governor in Virginia. His statue was removed, and in so doing, his head came off. I do not regret these demonstrations because, after all, those men with whom we had placed our love and affection for many years as the most loyal and dutiful subjects to the crown had turned against us. They became tyrants, and thus they forfeited all right to their subjects' obedience. I'm even given to understand that in New York City there was a statue, a lead statue of King George III, which was not only torn down, but melted down and formed into bullets. So be it, I say.
Mr. Randolph, our very dear friend Aaron would like to inquire after the health and well-being of your children.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I appreciate the question. My daughters are thriving well here in London. They have been much excited hearing my tales of it and Mrs. Randolph's tales of it, so they do love the society, and they are enjoying themselves fruitfully and fully here as much as two young ladies can and should. As far as my son, who still remains in Virginia, by his own choosing, he is at present, well, when we left, he was 22 years of age. Now he is 24. As such, truly, he is doing as he wishes because he can control himself under British law. He and I do not agree upon this, and truly, I've written him a letter as such saying, please come to your senses, come back to your king, remember who you are. Unfortunately, I've heard that he has resigned his post within the Continental Army, but he has taken up also my office in Williamsburg as the Attorney General of this new government. As such, for that, I am happy for him. I'd always hoped that he'd follow my footsteps, but I never thought that he would do so in rebellion. I do, however, worry about him and miss him every single day.
Thank you, sir, for sharing that with us.
Mr. Henry, there's been a question from Aaron about children, and I know with your recent new post and that you have a great many children. I'm curious, have any of your children joined you here in the capital city now that you've taken on this new role in our government? And you might wish to elaborate for those who are not maybe local to Virginia.
I lost my dear wife, Sally, the mother of my 6 children, 2 years ago, and I'm still observing an appropriate period of mourning. However, I am soon to be remarried later this year to a young lady by name of Dorothea Spotswood Dandridge. My eldest daughter, in the meantime, Martha, has seen to the responsibilities of managing the governor's mansion. So she is here with me, with her husband also, and a small child they just had. My eldest son, John, unhappily, is currently in New York with General Washington. He's a captain in the 1st Virginia Regiment in the Continental Line. William, my next eldest son, is here in Williamsburg with me, as is Annie, my daughter. But my two youngest, Bitsy and Nettie, are currently with my mother in the western reaches of Virginia, in Amelia County. I believe they're far safer there for being as young as they are, and with Williamsburg being so vulnerable to attack, I deemed it best to keep them separate from myself at this time.
Thank you.
Mr. Randolph, thank you for sharing with us the details of your situation with your son, but you leave not only family behind in Virginia, but also friends.
Yes.
And we are particularly interested to know your opinion of Mr. Patrick Henry, whom I believe you've been closely associated with.
Ah, yes, Mr. Patrick Henry. It all comes back to him, doesn't it? Seems these past, 12 years or so, everything has come because of that man, and whatever your opinions may be of him, I will say this, because I'm the one who signed his law license, everything is my fault. Truly. So either you're welcome or I'm sorry, depending on your opinion of the man. That said, Mr. Henry has always long been my friend. Ever since I told him when he appeared in my office, he taught me to never trust two appearances. For truly, when he appeared before me, he didn't look as though he was an attorney or even a gentleman at all, but he proved me wrong with his ability to argue convincingly a point, which I suppose that ability that he has, that natural talent for oratory, is what has led us down all of this path to begin with. He's a very convincing speaker, we know this. And he is my friend, and he will always be my friend. Even before, almost immediately before we did depart Virginia, I had to publish in the Gazettes talking about how people were putting words in my mouth, saying that I meant harm to him, that I would do something foul to him, and that would never be the case. I'm a gentleman, so is he. He is a dear friend of mine. Though we agree politically not at all, I still wish him as well as I can. In all of that still, at the end of all this, he is still a traitor to his crown. He is still a traitor to his government, and I am still the king's attorney for the colony of Virginia. So if it comes to it, I will do my duty as far as my friend Mr. Henry is concerned.
Thank you.
Governor Henry, when we last spoke with you, we were also speaking with the King's Attorney General, John Randolph. Now, much has changed in that time. I'm curious if your opinions of the man have changed in that time as well.
Unlike most of my fellow citizens here in Williamsburg, I cannot find it in my heart to speak ill of Mr. John Randolph. I owe him a great deal of debt and gratitude to the fact that I would not be an attorney myself were it not for his kindness and his condescension to agree to examine me to the law. Why, even his brother, Peyton, refused to grant me audience because I did not follow the customary traditions of learning the law. Most young men, of course, would read law with an established attorney for 4 to 5 years before they would dare to undertake their examinations. I was rather anxious to get some start in life, and he kindly agreed to examine me, signed my certificate. I'm very disappointed in that Mr. Randolph made the choice that he did, that he could not seem to shed that loyalty to the crown, which had clearly become tyrannical. And I would certainly welcome Mr. Randolph's return when this ugly business is over.
Thank you.
Mr. Randolph, Tina would like to know, shouldn't government be beholden to the people? And when the people disapprove of their government, should they not have the power to change it?
Tina, you have been reading Montesquieu. Good. With that, I would say to you, Tina, is that the government is beholden to the people. The British government truly is. It has an elected government. Yes, there are lords. Yes, there is His Majesty the King. But the people, as proven time and again through the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the people do control the government of Great Britain. And even in Virginia, the people control that government as well. However, as in all cases, tyranny takes many forms. Deceit takes many forms. Corruption takes many forms. And because of this has stricken both sides of this conflict, of this honestly, civil war, both in America and in Britain itself. Truly. So there are always ill politicians wherever you go. As far as should it be beholden to people, I would say it is. In every way. It is. And it should be. Because after all, that is a British right.
Thank you, sir.
Governor Henry, there's been some questions about whether or not a government should be beholden to its people. And clearly in this current conflict, you felt that Parliament was not acting in the best interests of the people here upon these shores. But I'm curious, now as you are a member of this new government, you are governor, the chief executive here in Virginia. You were part of that 5th Virginia Convention that created a new Bill of Rights and a Constitution. How did you try to ensure those rights? What is being done now that you are in a position of power that the government will continue to be beholden to the people in the future?
Before we drafted a constitution establishing a constitutional republic here in Virginia, we first composed a document which I believe to be the most important document ever conceived in the history of mankind. The chief architect of this document being my very close friend and longtime ally, Colonel George Mason of Fairfax County. I speak of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. 16 different articles laying out those rights which come from God, not from government, and as those rights come from God, they may not be removed by government at any time at present or in all of futurity. And when we ratified that document upon the 12th of June of '76, we then set about writing a framework of government designed to protect and defend and secure those individual liberties. So long as we maintain those values and those virtues that are expressed so eloquently in that document, we can stay the course and find ourselves a free people throughout all of eternity.
Thank you.
We have just time for just a few more questions, Mr. Randolph.
Of course.
And we were especially curious, would you ever return to Virginia if you could? And under what circumstances would you do so?
I would do so at the conclusion of this conflict. When the Crown wins this war, truly and things are put to right, it will be my duty to return to resume my office as the King's Attorney therein. Virginia is my home. I was born there, raised there, lived there until now. Of course I want to return. Truly, it is my dearest wish that I shall be buried there. That whatever happens to me, whatever falls to me, I wish to return home to Williamsburg. That city is, was, and will forever be my home, even though I do live here in London now. I just truly wish for everyone therein in Virginia to come to their senses so that I can safely return home. It isn't safe for me to do so now.
Thank you, sir.
Governor Henry, you've spoken a bit about this new Declaration of Rights that Virginia has put forward and what Virginia is doing to move forward. But in declaring independency, we did so with other colonies. So what is your hope for the Union as we move forward? Is it only your intention to think of Virginia in our future, or all of these 13 former colonies that have now declared themselves independent?
Well, certainly we cannot face the power and the might of the British government alone. I'm very happy with our alliance currently in struggling against Great Britain in the defense of our rights and liberties, and I certainly pray that that alliance will continue as we move forward and this war is ended. We, of course, are not only situated upon the same continent, but we're dependent upon one another for trade, and for mutual defense. When this war is ended, there may be another in future, perhaps the French, the Spanish, and I'm confident that we would be able to once again join forces together to defend ourselves at such a time of emergency. Of course, not for one moment would I be willing to surrender our sovereignty to the power of a majority of men who have very little in common with us. The idea that Mr. Joseph Galloway proposed several years ago at the first Congress of an American Parliament is one that I vigorously opposed then and would do so in future. But united we stand, divided we certainly will fall.
Is it fair to say, Governor Henry, that you might find another form of protest if you were to see in our future that American Parliament, as you have mentioned?
Once again, I would urge our citizens, if they thought that there was some danger to their rights and liberties, to first proceed peacefully and lawfully, reasonably and constitutionally. But in the end, if none of those have the success that we're seeking, then I would certainly say overturn whatever efforts there might be towards surrendering Virginia's sovereignty and preeminence to a Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Henry.
A final question to you, Mr. Randolph. You seem very certain that the Crown will win this war. What do you think the future holds for Great Britain and for America? And not simply on a governmental scale, but on an individual scale for the people involved, as you've also spoken so eloquently of the human cost of this war.
Well, truly, the fact that the Civil War is even going has shown that both sides, no matter how it turns out, both sides have already lost because shots are being fired, men are dying, people are going to war, people are being ripped from their homes. Everything that we've created before has been ripped apart, rent asunder, and being not necessarily made anew. Perhaps it is, but maybe not being made better. What will happen at the end of this is when, as I said before, when Great Britain wins this war, will be a terrible toll upon all those who opposed her. People that I know, men that I know, will have the highest weight of the law falling directly upon them. And it will be my duty to do that. However, at the same point, those who had no take upon the conflict at all, these people will also more than likely be reft out of their homes. Because that is happening upon all levels of society. Whatever terms are going to be set upon America will be handed from on high, from Parliament. They will have to accept it. We all remember well what happened some 30-odd years ago at Culloden, when the Scots had their entire way of life taken from them. All dictated out by the British Crown. That's going to happen again. Either way, but still, even upon the other side of this, let's say that the Americans do happen to win. Heaven help all of them. Because these are men who operate not upon reason, but upon their own public and personal interest. That must be closely guarded, because the people who are going to war are taking the easy path, not the civil one, not the genteel one. So no matter how this turns out, everyone, unfortunately, has already lost. It will only be a terrible reckoning for everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Henry, I'm afraid we have time for only one more question, but the last question looks to our future. What do you think lies in our future? This fight is currently ongoing, but is not guaranteed, and even upon its conclusion, what happens next is certainly unknown territory. I'm curious if you may speak to what you are hopeful, what you think the future may hold.
I have every confidence that we will be victorious in this war against our mother country. As I said 2 years ago, Almighty God is on our side. He is the same God, unchanged and unchangeable, friend to the oppressed, enemy to the oppressor, and he will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. We are on the verge of establishing a bold new experiment, a land whereby the three branches of government are separate, distinct, largely equal, but always with the greatest share of power being with that of the people, with the legislature. And so long as we have a well-engaged and well-informed citizenry, I am confident that we will see times of great prosperity and promise ahead. So stay the course, my friends. But with this, I offer forth a caution. History determines, it shows everywhere, that a republic can only survive so long as its people are very well informed and engaged. And if we should ever become so apathetic and indifferent a society as to ignore what those men in government are up to, then we very richly deserve the form of government we get.
Thank you.
This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.